President Trump, he sees oil and gas in the United States as sort of the world's leader, not only from a production standpoint, being the world's largest oil and gas producer and exporter. The problem that I see is, when you're trying to deregulate and you're trying to undo previous regs, you have to go to the courts now and explain to them that you're changing course because you have the best interpretation. Right. We have a real serious issue in that we've got the AI innovation in this country. It's here, it's real. But if you don't have the power, the electricity, obviously we're going to lose this battle here with China and others. So I think the utilities are certainly going to be weighing in very strongly in favor of keeping those credits. There's one issue that President Trump has been absolutely consistent on over the last 40 years. It's been trade. He's talked about trade and tariffs going all the way back to the 80s. And so this is kind of an article of faith for him.
Good afternoon and welcome to Political Capital. Today we'll be exploring what a second Trump administration would mean for the energy sector and for Cleantech in particular. My name is Nate Loewentheil. I'm the founder and managing partner of Commonweal Ventures and the host of Political Capital. Political Capital is a conversation series exploring the intersection of technology, policy, and finance. We are joined today by Commonweal advisor Mike Catanzaro, president of CGCN, a leading government affairs firm in Washington, D.C. Mike is an energy expert and a leading Republican energy policymaker. He's served in senior policy positions across the federal government, including in the U.S. House of Representatives, the Senate, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the White House. Most recently, Mike served as special assistant to President Donald Trump for domestic energy and environmental policy at the White House National Economic Council, in which I served in the Obama administration. Today, as he did in 2016, Mike is advising Trump's transition team on personnel and policy. Mike, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Nate, appreciate the invitation. Really great to be with you.
So look, the election is coming up fast. I think it's fair to say at this point that it's a toss-up. Polling has the two candidates neck and neck. And while energy policy is maybe not top of mind for voters, it's certainly an area where the two candidates have staked out, pretty different positions. And a Trump victory would mean a real shift in focus. So maybe let's start there. What would Trump's top energy priorities be if he was elected president?
I think a good sort of heuristic device is to go and look at some of the previous executive orders that President Trump signed in the first term. I can go back to, I think, March of 2017, Executive Order 13783, promoting energy independence and economic growth. It was pretty standard fare in that, as with any new administration coming in, looking at their predecessor from a different party, we kind of went through and looked at all the various rulemakings that we thought could potentially be burdensome or obstructive to developing America's energy resources across the board, not just oil and gas, but it was very explicit in the executive order that we were talking basically just about everything America has, we want to utilize to the fullest extent. And so basically what you do is you go through and you say EPA or DOE or Interior Department, CEQ, go through, examine the regs you have on the books, particularly the specific ones that we've seen over the last couple of years of the last administration, and you should review them and then potentially revise them or rescind them. And so a lot of what you've seen from the Biden administration, particularly at EPA, will certainly be front and center in terms of changes and potential repeals. For example, the EPA, sort of colloquially referred to as the Clean Power Plan 2.0, we'll see what the Supreme Court does with that stay here probably any moment or any day. Those types of things, I think, that are very obviously, contrary to President Trump's sort of philosophy and policy agenda on energy and the environment. So that effort will sort of proceed apace. And then I know we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the legislative issues related to the IRA and certainly the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act next year. But from a regulatory standpoint, you will see reversals and repeals of a lot of Biden rules. And then, I think beyond that, there will just be an effort across the board to remove, again, any of these obstacles. Think about the leasing issues at the Department of Interior, where, again, I think you'll probably have a number of people who served in the Interior Department under Trump 1.0 who would come back and try to re-up the leasing regime, both onshore and offshore, that they promoted in the first term. And again, at the sort of Bureau of Management level, are you issuing your applications for permit to drill fast enough? And so those sorts of things will be reviewed. But, there's this sort of I guess President Trump says it all the time, and it's a proxy, I guess, for a broader agenda. But he says drill, baby, drill, doesn't offer a lot of the details. But people think, well, that just means he favors oil and gas and nothing else, and that's just not the case. Oil, gas, nuclear, I think onshore, solar. He's said I'm perfectly fine with solar. Offshore wind is where things get a little bit difficult. I think he's got some issues there, but maybe we can get into kind of what that looks like from a leasing perspective. But I think that kind of captures what he is thinking and what the administration will be trying to accomplish over the next 4 years if he wins.
Yeah, so I think what I hear you saying is the what the Trump administration did the first time around is a pretty good signal for what they'll do the second time around. And in a sense, first time around they were repealing a lot of what Obama might have done through the EPA or the Department of Interior. This time it would be what Biden has done, but there's a bit of a circularity there.
That's right.
I remember after Biden got elected, shares of Tesla started, going through the roof because everyone thought, as turned out to be the case, that the Biden administration would be doing a lot to support the EV sector, and Tesla was sort of an obvious winner there. I hear you saying the Trump administration will be supporting a lot of conventional energy, in addition to maybe to solar and some other, renewables, nuclear. How do you think energy markets are likely to react to a Trump victory? And, are there particular sectors that you think, frankly, would benefit a little bit more or a little bit less?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, the oil and gas component of the president's agenda, I think that's kind of paramount. I think he sees oil and gas in the United States as sort of the world's leader, not only from a production standpoint, but I think there's a sense that there's a national security angle to being the world's largest oil and gas producer and exporter. National security from a positive perspective, that's good for the United States. We have all these resources and we're exporting them abroad to our allies. I think there might be a mistake in the market in terms of interpreting a Trump administration, as I said before, as being sort of hostile to clean tech or to renewable energy. And again, that's just not the case. I think if anything, as we saw at the Interior Department, for example, in the first go round, I think there's just an inclination to try to deregulate and again, remove bureaucratic obstacles to all sorts of energy. So I think where we might see some difficulties, I suppose, is on the IRA and how the Inflation Reduction Act, some of those tax credits, grants, loan programs, how is all that going to fare, particularly if you have a Republican trifecta when inevitably next year Congress moves to advance the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You've seen, I'm sure, and listeners have seen that there's now kind of a debate within the Republican Party about what to do with the IRA, particularly the tax credits. Many of them that have bipartisan support, for example, 45Q, CCS, right, the nuclear production tax credit, hydrogen, on the list, even wind and solar, and transferring to sort of the tech neutral side of those credits. You got a lot of Republicans in very key senior positions who are going to be asking to keep some of these credits on the books. Again, 45Q, good examples up in North Dakota, Project Tundra, a massive CCS project on a very large lignite coal plant. You're going to have Senator Kevin Cramer and Senator Hoeven and Governor Burgum basically saying, "Hey, we need 45Q to make this work." So those are the types of things you'll start to see. 18 House Republicans signed a letter a few weeks ago saying, "Don't throw the baby without the bathwater." So I think President Trump will be sympathetic to a lot of those arguments. Another example, battery manufacturing plants happening in Georgia. A huge success story. I think in terms of EVs and the EV tax credit, if I had to guess in terms of what's the most vulnerable to go away, it probably would be that one. Although I wonder what Elon Musk will think of that. Does he think he needs it? He always says, "I don't need subsidies or mandates." But the president's been very clear, President Trump, on the campaign trail, that he's not a fan of this administration's approach to EVs. He dubs the EPA tailpipe rule and the NHTSA cafe rulemakings as basically an EV mandate. Right. So you'll see a lot of activity to sort of undo those. But the EV credit, again, that's going to be a tough one to keep. But for the most part, I think some of those other credits, there will be a robust debate. Will they all look the same, as they did before? Will there be tweaks, changes? Maybe eligibility rules could be stiffened. Maybe they won't be available for 10 years. Maybe it's 5 years, because Republicans are desperately going to be trying to find as many offsets as they possibly can to help pay for that 10-year TCJA extension, which, at least as of now, according to CBO, is scoring at about 5.9 trillion. And Trump keeps adding, additional sort of tax measures on top of that. So we could be getting $7, $8, $9 trillion on reconciliation. You don't have to close that gap to advance a reconciliation bill past, the Senate parliamentarian. But I think, given the concerns about deficits, that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, let's get back to the EVs in a minute. But just on the IRA, to kind of pick that back up, for Commonweal's listeners, for political capital listeners, that's a big topic because there are many thousand of venture-backed startups that, in one way or another, are premised on the IRA's sort of surge of investment into the clean energy sector. It's, as you noted, it's been pretty controversial. Some Republicans, on the other hand, at least some money's starting to flow into the ground there. So what I hear you saying is that you don't anticipate a sort of direct, unified assault on the overall sort of structure of the bill. It may end up being more about tweaking some of the incentives or tax policy, rather than repealing the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. A good way to think about this is, what happened last year with the Fiscal Responsibility Act when then Speaker McCarthy was trying to deal with the debt limit suspension and increase, and knew that was going to be a tough haul with a number of his more conservative members. So in his first iteration of that bill to raise the debt limit, he included a lot of pay-fors from the Inflation Reduction Act, and there was a very swift and vociferous backlash from a number of Republicans, mostly those who support biofuels, ethanol, and other things like that. But the message was delivered loud and clear, like, hey, you can't do this. You shouldn't do this. It's going to hurt us. And so that's one. And the other piece of this is I was kind of skeptical, I will say, 6 months or a year ago, where I think there was a lot of sort of cavalier discussion about, well, all these projects are being, quote, announced in red district states. And you go and you look it up and you say, okay, there's a press release. They're announcing a project. Just because you announce a project, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get support at the end of the day from that Republican member. If President Trump, say, is barnstorming through his or her district saying, get rid of these credits, Joe Biden's climate law, I got to pay for your tax cut. But you're starting to see a number of these projects actually coming to fruition, or at least advancing enough whereby I think Republicans members are like, we got to keep these. We got to protect these projects. And if these projects are in good part dependent on keeping these credits in place, that, to me, we're getting to that point where now I think it's going to be really hard politically to go in and get rid of all this. I don't think the votes will be there, because I think Republicans keep the House. It won't be by much as it is today. You'll have 3, 4, 5 seat majority at best. And so you will have, again, a number of these Republicans with a lot of leverage saying, keep these credits or some of these credits in place. And I think, decent chance they win the day on that.
Right. So in other words, there are actual projects getting built now, some real jobs that are, if not created, then very close to being created. It feels tangible to policymakers. And in that context, even in a world where Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House, it may survive.
Yeah. Again, I go back to Georgia. It's kind of interesting that, Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of the most conservative members in Congress, she's in a district where she's got battery manufacturing happening right now. I mean, that's a place where these projects are well advanced. And so she, I think, I don't want to speak for her by any means, but, she would be, I think, hard pressed to come in and say, get rid of the credit and put that project or projects in jeopardy. That's going to be a hard thing to do politically.
Yeah. It's interesting how the kind of design of the bill that incentivized development really across the country, and frankly, probably more in Republican states than Democratic states, as the political economy of the whole thing has kind of shifted the political alignment.
Yeah, and I think, there's a question that I think arises is, well, why is this happening? Why are these projects happening more in red states than blue states? I'm not sure it was really designed that way, but I think companies found, well, great, we have a credit in hand. Let's go to a state like Georgia where we know the permitting process is going to be a little bit easier. Obviously, there's a federal component to that, but Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio, these are states where you've got Republican governors and legislatures, and I just think that their experience in terms of going through the permitting process there is just easier than going through blue states. I think blue states are seeing that, understanding that, and making changes on their own, but I think that's why we see more of these projects in red states and districts.
You mentioned the kind of broader, IRA is one piece of it, but there's a broader tax debate, which is going to come up, early, and whoever's the next president come up early in their term. So how do you see that broader tax debate impacting the kind of energy and clean energy markets?
Yeah, well, one thing to think about as you're thinking about reconciliation next year, because reconciliation, as you know, in the Senate only requires a vote of 51 to get through, or a simple majority. You get to circumvent or obviate the filibuster requirement there. So as such, Republicans, as the Democrats did, I think, with the IRA, are trying to figure out, are there other things that we can put into the mix, other things that you have to have policies that have a budgetary impact in order to pass what's called the Byrd Rule, which is a Senate rule, arcane rule that the parliamentarian enforces to say reconciliation is just a revenue measure and you can't do just policy without
it has to have a revenue
impact. Right. So Republicans are saying, okay, well, why don't we look at something like permitting reform? And why don't we attach a revenue component to it? For example, your company X, if you pay a fee, you get to go through an expedited pathway. If you're just dealing with NEPA, maybe the language says that you get your EIS and then there's no litigation. You're protected against NEPA litigation. Again, if you pay a fee, there's auction concepts are being discussed. So that's something I think folks need to be paying close attention to. It's kind of under the radar right now, but it's certainly
a market-based mechanism to accelerate permitting.
Yeah, exactly. And then in terms of the broader tax debate, I think Republicans, I was wondering that Republicans, more of a populist component in the party, that maybe they would be susceptible to raising the corporate rate from, say, 21 to 25, or I think Vice President Harris has it at 28, and then using the, quote, savings from that to send it over to the personal side of the equation to increase child tax credit or other marginal rate cuts for lower and middle class folks. But I'm not hearing that. And so, in fact, if anything, President Trump has signaled he'd be willing to go lower than the 21% corporate rate. So, again, I think the Republican Party certainly has changed a lot. It's a lot more populist, but I think I'm not picking up any signals that you're going to see a ton of changes on that front, which I think probably should be a good thing for the markets and folks that you're talking about.
Let's talk now maybe a little bit more broadly about kind of renewables in a second Trump administration. The IRA is one piece of it, but as you started talking about, previously, there are a lot of other levers that the federal government can pull to slow or accelerate renewable energy development. Leasing is a part of it. Permitting is a part of it. There's also, under the Biden administration, the federal government itself has made big commitments to procure clean energy, which has a big impact on markets, that kind of forward commitments. So how do you think the Trump administration would approach renewable energy, broadly speaking?
Yeah, you mentioned federal procurement, which is interesting. That's an area where I think a Trump administration via, CEQ, which I think kind of oversees procurement rules, at least on the environment, that would be something you could easily see changing. Basically reversing what Biden is trying to do. I think there's a pretty clear sense that they want renewables and they don't want fossil fuels, and that there are kinds of reporting requirements from a climate perspective are attached to that. Those are the types of things that I think you can do away with fairly easily without having to worry about getting sued. And so you'll see those types of early administration actions on things like leasing, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar. I know particularly with offshore wind, there's a kind of a fear that Trump administration would come in knowing the president's hostility to offshore wind, that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management would just start clawing back contracts and pulling leases back. I don't see that. I think that is a terrible waste of time because, in my view, it's blatantly illegal. And I think whoever's on the opposite end of that would easily go into court and probably win. But are there other things where, say, an Interior Department via BOEM would maybe restrict the growth of offshore wind because of stated concerns on marine mammals and whales, and certainly I think the commercial fishing community they have a voice, a very strong voice, I think, within the Trump administration. So that will be something else to think about. But when it comes to onshore, it's permitting really. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. And if Congress can't reach agreement on a permitting reform bill, which we can talk about that in a bit, but really what you're doing is you're doing your best to try to remove some of these bureaucratic obstacles, but you're going to get sued. You're going to get sued every step of the way, even on renewable energy. And in fact, there was a Stanford study just last year that said solar, I think, is the most litigated form of energy. And according to that study from like 2020 to 2022 or something along those lines. But it really was kind of eye-opening to see that, if you're renewables, you're not in the clear, and you do have even activists, I think environmental groups, but also landowners getting in the way in many cases. So you could try to deal with that administratively, which this administration, a Trump administration certainly would, because as I said, there's basically a pervasive kind of deregulatory bias. For the most part, they're going to try to do that. And I think that's a positive for renewables here. Again, offshore wind is a little trickier, but everything else in the renewable space, I think, is probably going to like what they see because, again, if these regulations can get out of the way and allow them to do their investments, build their projects, that's all for the good.
Yeah, I mean, permitting has really rented the environmental movement, I don't know if in half, but certainly in two, in the sense that it pits conservationists and sometimes sort of very locally oriented conservationists against, clean energy developers who feel like, they're trying to solve climate change, and the local conservationists are like, we're trying to protect this or that habitat. Neither is a crazy position, but it puts them really in direct conflict. And that's been, I think really hard for Democratic administrations to deal with. The administrative permitting reform is a tough row to hoe. I mean, we worked on that in the Obama administration. I'd like to think we made some progress, but I'm not sure you could see it in the numbers.
Right.
So, how much do you think really can be done administratively there versus much more fundamental legislative reform? And if the latter, that's been a big topic for a while. Manchin's been, talking about that. Obviously, Republicans are supportive. Do you see kind of space there for some real, more meaningful change?
Yeah, I think, as you say, when it comes to permitting reform, if you're just trying to do it administratively, it really is hard. And one thing that I'm thinking a lot about, and others I know I've talked with, is, the Supreme Court did away with the Chevron deference doctrine in a case called Loewentheil.
Yeah.
And still early days, this decision is to sort of filter down to the lower courts to see how they actually interpret that. But I think those who are of a deregulatory bent, were basically in a celebratory mood because of it, still are. But, the problem that I see is that even, when you're trying to deregulate and you're trying to undo previous regs, you have to go to the courts now and explain to them that you're changing course because you have the best interpretation of a particular statute. That's the standard now, not is it reasonable if you're changing from one position to another. Yeah, it's reasonable. You explained it. You created a record. You're good to go. That's not going to be the case anymore. So, the Loewentheil decision could come back and really bite the Trump administration trying to undo some of these rules, because really it gets down to statutory interpretation in many cases. So again, I do think in Congress, I do see some encouraging signs. You do see more and more Democrats coming out, as you say, and understanding that the permitting process across the board for all forms of energy is absolutely abysmal, particularly on things like transmission, right? I think that's a big priority for Democrats. We saw the transmission component in the Senate bill that was drafted by Senator Manchin. The Energy Committee with Senator Brasso, Republican. They included a very robust provision to try to streamline approvals and basically figure out a way to divvy up cost allocation. Who pays at the end of the day?
That's always the big issue.
And right, it's a huge issue. But at the end of the day, that only gets you partway there, because if you figure those components out, FERC has more of a centralized role. You figured out cost allocation. Okay, well, go ahead and try to build it.
Yeah.
These are multi-state projects. They're really, really difficult, as we've seen over many years. If you look at permitting reform failures, usually they're transmission lines that are, take 15 or 16 years to build. So that recognition, I think now the Democratic Party understands that in order for these projects to occur, to get online, and then to really start reducing emissions to get to net zero by 2050, we can't do that with the permitting process we have now. So I'm looking at either reconciliation next year, but then in 2026, the highway bill comes up. It has to be reauthorized. And to me, that seems like a very logical place to do a permitting reform compromise, especially on a highway bill, which is pretty bipartisan to begin.
Yeah, interesting. Another political factor here that may encourage some progress is the extraordinary surge in electricity demand from the use of data centers for AI, and the point at which you have the really large technology companies saying, look, we need more electricity, we need a stable long-term source. That starts to maybe shift the political alignment a little bit in interesting ways.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating issue, and one we've got to get our heads around and solve here pretty quickly, because in the interim, in the vacuum essentially that's been created, you're starting to see, as you say, tech companies teaming up with, as they did in Pennsylvania, Talon Energy, with the Susquehanna nuke plant, joining forces with Amazon. Amazon's co-locating. They forge a power purchase agreement over 20 years with that plant. Great. They've got zero emissions, 24/7, 365. But the argument from a number of other utilities is, hey, wait a minute, this isn't fair, violates the Federal Power Act. You can't do this. You're taking the power offline, which creates reliability issues. And then our constituents have to end up paying more to help restore the grid. And oh, by the way, when that nuke plant goes offline, you're going back on the grid and taking power that you're not paying for. Those are, I suppose, valid criticisms and concerns. To me, it's going to be fascinating to see if FERC intervenes into these cases and takes one side or the other. I don't think they will. I certainly hope they don't. We'll see how all this plays out. But we have a real serious issue in that we've got the AI innovation in this country. It's here. It's real. But if you don't have the power, the electricity, obviously we're going to lose this battle here with China and others. So we've got to figure this out. It's going to take a while to do it. And, I'm not seeing encouraging signs on this front, I think, from some who are saying, well, if you want to build more new plants, or we need more natural gas, like that's not the answer. We got to figure out renewables with batteries, and that's maybe the way to go. I want it all to be considered. I don't want to see this divide in terms of like fossil fuels, forget it, nuclear, forget it. It's got to be wind and solar. But we got to figure this out. We might need legislation to figure it out. But this is going to be the most significant debate, I think, in energy policy over the next 5 to 10 years.
I completely agree. You mentioned the utilities, and I know that, in your day job, you represent a number of, of large utilities. How are they thinking about, a second Trump administration and, its energy priorities, especially as it intersects with renewables, which they've been under a lot of pressure on, from maybe their constituents, but certainly from Democratic lawmakers?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, utilities they want to see the TCJA extended. I think they would like to see the corporate rates stay where it is. I think that's a big priority for them next year. And then, of course, Inflation Reduction Act.
The Tax Cuts and Job Act.
Correct, yes. And as part of that, the IRA discussion, I think the utilities are certainly going to be weighing in very strongly in favor of keeping those credits. And they're, as I say, are going to have a lot of sympathetic figures within the Republican Party. So they will be up, and already are, making sure the Congress and Republicans understand how important these credits are for, the particular members' constituents, keeping power prices under control and getting rid of them. I think the argument they're going to make, and they are making, is you get rid of those, you're raising costs for consumers, creating uncertainty in the marketplace. The grid's kind of in a precarious position vis-a-vis reliability. So we need to make sure that we're keeping these incentives in place so that we can build this stuff. So that's kind of how they're looking at it. I think they were probably a year ago or a lot more worried about the prospect of Trump 2.0, but I think as they've seen Republicans and what they've been saying in Congress now, IRA, parts of it really important to keep. President Trump he's saying it's basically all going to go away, but I think that's more rhetorical than anything else. But having said all that, I do think the utilities are a lot less leery of Trump 2.0 than they maybe were last year.
Right. So for them, the big priorities are the corporate tax rate's a big deal, and the IRA is a big deal because it's essentially lowering costs, and also they've in many cases made investments or depending on investments that others are making that are directly tied to the IRA tax credit. So they have a deep economic interest in its continuation.
Exactly right. Yep.
Yeah. I just want to pick up on one really interesting thing you said, which I had not thought about. The Chevron doctrine sounds very esoteric, but it's this, really important piece of our jurisprudence that gives great deference or significant deference to agencies to interpret unclear statutes as they do rulemaking. And what I hear you saying is that in an interesting way, it's actually going to make it harder for a new presidential administration to roll back an existing rule, because before that decision, a agency could say, we're going to reopen this. Essentially, we're going to get a bunch of data and we're going to make a different decision based on that data. And we're going to get deference from the courts because our decision, it was a close call last time around. We're going to go, they went 51-49. We're going to go the other way. But now they need to prove that, in fact, the previous interpretation was the wrong interpretation of the statute, and their interpretation is the right interpretation of the statute, which is actually harder than just a slight shift in the evidentiary burden.
Yes, exactly right. I think one effect over time of this post-Chevron world we're living in is that it may reduce the uncertainties from one administration to the next. You get these pendulum swings where you have all these rules and regs, and you guys come in and say, well, we're undoing it, as you said, because ours, it's reasonable to do it, and they were wrong, but we built this record, so court give us deference. You're not going to get that anymore. So how does all this play out remains to be seen. But there's no question the Supreme Court has its eye on the administrative state, and they're seeking ways to limit, in some cases, reduce their power and authority. And so I don't think they're done yet. I mean, certainly we had West Virginia v. EPA with the major questions doctrine, which effectively says that Congress has to speak very clearly and explicitly to any issue that has major economic or political significance. Some are thinking that maybe the non-delegation doctrine could come back to life, which is another arcane thing that really cropped up in the 1930s during the New Deal, when the Supreme Court was striking down New Deal legislation. And then Roosevelt threatened to pack the court, and then we never heard the non-delegation again. But now you're starting to actually see plaintiffs coming into court and making non-delegation arguments, effectively saying in some cases, Congress cannot delegate lawmaking authority to the executive branch. They have to, if they do it, they have to have an intelligible principle around it. Congress has to make the policy decision and then hand off to an executive branch agency like EPA the ability to implement it. I don't know how all that's going to play out, but we're going to have some major landmark decisions on the environment from the Supreme Court, certainly on Clean Power Plan 2.0. We also have a major NEPA case before the Supreme Court right now. We probably should get that decision next June or so, but that's going to be very significant because I think the Supreme Court will probably scale back, the authority to, for example, look upstream and downstream from your projects. Like if you're building a gas pipeline, the DC Circuit continues to say, well, you have to think about producing upstream if you're producing natural gas going into the pipeline. And if the pipeline is connecting to a power plant, you've got to take into account the emissions from there too. It's a very sort of attenuated way to look at these things. But again, this is the first NEPA case we've seen in 20 years. So I think it's going to be very, very significant.
Yeah, what I hear you saying is there's, for reasonable, you can understand there's a lot of tension on the presidential election, but, that's one branch of our government, and what the Supreme Court does over the next year is also going to, reshape the kind of landscape in which these decisions are made. So you got to keep your eye on that as well.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that, as I think the Supreme Court gets upwards of 7,000 cert petitions every year. It'd probably only take about 70 of them. The DC Circuit is obviously a really important court. They call it the second most important court in the land, and they hear a lot of these administrative regulatory cases. Yeah. Good example, FERC, has finalized approvals for a couple of certificates for new gas pipelines in the Northeast and approved an LNG export facility as well. And the DC Circuit, for a variety of reasons, struck those down. And the DC Circuit is I think, regarded across the board as not being favorable to industry, shall we say. But that's where a lot of these cases end up, and the Supreme Court doesn't take a lot of these appeals. So that's also something to think about, that court is very stacked against industry in a number of different ways. So that's going to be interesting to watch.
Going back to kind of Trump's agenda, one area where the Trump administration took a very sharp turn from Obama was around trade policy. That has actually been pretty important in the renewable energy world because of tariffs on solar. which were favorable for U.S. manufacturing, but may have slowed down overall solar deployment. The Biden administration, interestingly, has been pretty consistent with Trump on trade stuff. I think reasonable to say Trump really changed the national conversation on those subjects. How do you see a second Trump administration approaching trade policy, as it relates to renewables and solar panels and the like?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if there's one issue that President Trump has been absolutely consistent on over the last 40 years, it's been trade. I mean, he's talked about trade and tariffs going all the way back to the 80s and the Reagan administration. And so this is kind of an article of faith for him. So when he says, I want to impose, 10% across the board tariff when I come in as sort of a negotiating or bargaining chip, I think folks need to take him very seriously. I wouldn't be surprised to see someone like Bob Lighthizer coming back in the administration in some capacity. He was former head of USTR. Lighthizer really was the architect. President Trump conceptually came up with his agenda, but then very brilliantly, I would argue, Lighthizer helped implement it in USTR. He helped get the United States, US, Canada, Mexico agreement, the successor to NAFTA, across the finish line. So a lot of success stories there. But you're totally right. I agree with you. I think Trump did single-handedly change the trajectory of the trade debate in Washington, D.C. I think up until 2015-16, free trade pretty much on both sides of the aisle was also an article of faith. And when Trump came in, and the sort of populist streak that's now very prevalent in the Republican Party, all very supportive of tariffs and using tariffs to protect domestic industries. And I don't see that changing at all. And in fact, I think the tariff regime could get even more stringent over time if you have Trump 2.0.
And Lighthizer has been, publicly discussed as a potential, not by Trump himself maybe, but by others as a potential Treasury Secretary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I hear you saying is, trade policy in the second Trump's going to look a lot like trade policy in the first Trump, and that means tariffs, on solar panels, and maybe good for manufacturing in the U.S., maybe bad for solar deployment, but that's sort of going to be what it is.
Yeah, I mean, there is one thing I'm sure you and folks you talked are paying attention to. There's a anti-dumping countervailing duty case right now before the International Trade Commission, basically trying to get at China circumventing tariffs by sending their products through a supply chain that goes through, I think, Malaysia, Indonesia, and a couple other countries. So that's playing out right now. And I think the expectation is that the ITC is going to say, in fact, yes, China is circumventing the tariffs by sending them through those Southeast Asian companies or countries. And I don't think President Trump would disagree with that at all. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think the Biden ban on Chinese imports of EVs, I find it hard to believe maybe that Trump would come in and just undo that one. I don't think so. I think it probably stays put or maybe even gets more stringent. So, yeah, that what you saw in 1.0, you'll see again in 2.0 and maybe in a little bit higher, more stringent level than what we saw from 2017 to 2021.
I'm flattered that you think I'm tracking the International Trade Court disputes as closely as you are. But you mentioned the kind of Chinese EV policies. The auto industry has been really front and center in many ways in the debate. Obviously big industry in the Midwest, which, may define the election. EV policy has been maybe the most controversial part of Biden's clean energy, agenda. The Biden administration has used, tax policy, infrastructure investments, CAFE standards, as you mentioned earlier, through NHTSA and whatever, to advance, EVs. And Trump has argued that those EV requirements are, hurting the U.S. auto industry and create this kind of mandate for EVs. On the other hand, the auto industry has said, we think, this is the direction the market's heading, and they've made a lot of commitments around it. So it's a complicated political issue for Trump. What do you think the posture of a Trump White House would be towards the auto market, generally, and EVs specifically in a second go around?
Yeah, a lot to unpack here, as you say. I think, just as a general high-level political matter, I would say there's some tension between President Trump and the domestic auto industry. I think going back to 2017, the president early on in his administration gave a speech in Detroit announcing that the administration would undertake to undo the Obama administration standards, both at EPA and then at NHTSA, and then certainly includes the California waiver. And he gave that speech to great applause and support from the industry. And then over time, the industry started breaking off. They got a lot of pressure, I think, from, among others, environmental activist groups on the left. And then California intervened and pulled off a number of the autos to sort of work with them. And those autos were saying, we don't agree with the direction Trump's going in. So it was kind of a mess. And I think the president sort of blames the industry for that. Now, coming back 2.0, what's the relationship going to be like? I think it's going to take some time to fix. But nonetheless, I think there's a very clear sense that when you look at what EPA has done, for example, is it technically a ban? Does it say ban in the preamble? No, but trying to get to 60+%, 65% EV penetration over the next 8 years, it's impossible. I don't think it's going to happen. And so if you're trying to force Americans into these cars to make it happen, one, it won't work. And secondly, I think it will create a lot of political headaches for those who think this type of policy should be on the books. The California waiver, to me, is probably the most significant part of this equation, where California wants to ban internal combustion engines by 2035. Their waiver request under the Clean Air Act is sitting at EPA as we speak. And if that's granted and that holds, there will be litigation for sure. Then you're talking 50% or more of the domestic market, because you have to remember that it's not just California. There are states under the Clean Air Act that can follow California's emission standards. I think there are 17 different states. So, yeah, you're talking well over 40, 50% of the market. So if that holds and that stands, then that 2035 ban, effectively, that's the goal. That's what you got to get to. So these are really, really difficult legal issues, political issues, foreign policy issues, because when you talk about EVs, one of the reasons I think they're so controversial is because it's always brought up that, the critical minerals you need to build the battery components and the vehicles, China in some respects controls a lot of those supply chains. They certainly control an overwhelming amount of the critical mineral processing. So how do you deal with that? How do you reshore that capability back to the United States? That's going to be a very interesting area for the Trump administration to watch, because I think they're going to want to try to increase or expand the domestic mining industry in this country. There were a number of mines in process that I think this administration pulled permits for and has put on ice. I think the Trump administration would come in and try to find a variety of ways to bring those back, or then encourage new mines to be developed. But the permitting process could very well stand in the way of that. But that's going to be interesting to see how they balance all of those things in terms of undoing the Biden, regulatory regime on EVs, getting it back to what they think is the sounder legal and practical footing, and then again dealing with some of these supply chain issues, on the back end. So
yeah. Again, I mean, as a Democrat, the mining issues are tricky.
Yep.
It on part of the Democratic party is focused on building EVs and wind turbines. All batteries, all of which depend on critical minerals. On the other hand, mines even the best mines have non-trivial environmental consequences. So that's another one of those issues where kind of you're splitting the environmental movement into.
That's right. Exactly.
Kind of final topic for the day is around innovation policy. Again, we're in the business at Commonweal of investing in startups, and one area where startups benefit from government funding is around innovation. There's a lot of federal money that goes into R&D and all sorts of different programs and different agencies. And the Biden administration has focused a lot of their energy and time and money on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And you've seen that through ARPA-E, you've seen that through the DOE Loan Program Office very publicly. The Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency Office has a lot of power to regulate electrical appliances of different kinds. They're using those rules to push the market towards energy efficiency. It has a big impact on clean tech markets. Where do you see a second Trump administration kind of focusing when it comes to federal energy innovation policy, or your innovation policy generally? Who's likely to benefit or lose out in that context?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting when it comes to energy efficiency. I think Republicans have been very critical of this Department of Energy because they have been very aggressive in pushing energy efficiency standards across the board under the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, it is really difficult to come in and try to unwind those and try to scale them back because there's an anti-backsliding provision in EPCA, which makes that legally very problematic. So I'm not sure, there were some attempts to try to do that in the first go around, maybe again, but I'm not so sure they'll be successful legally. I think in terms of innovation, probably high atop the list will be continuing to advance nuclear as much as possible, the next gen of nuclear power plants, SMRs and the like. That's one of the few bipartisan issues in Congress, as we discussed. You've had 3 or 4 major statutes passed in the last 4 years. Just this summer, Congress passed the Advance Act and President Biden signed it. So I think there'll be a very aggressive push on nuclear, not just because this administration thinks it's great, but going back to this AI data center debate, I think there's going to be a sense that, well, let's just build more SMRs and we'll help you do it. I think, Governor Perry, when he was DOE secretary, was very supportive of the national labs and making sure they were well funded. And he was very bullish on their ability to help spawn new technologies and bring about innovations, across the energy sector. So, part of that will be determined by who the next DOE secretary is. But there's a number of good candidates in the mix who really understand the importance of DOE in some of these places, of providing that seed capital to get some of these projects off the ground and innovate. So I think it's actually on the whole, DOE especially is going to be in a pretty good spot on some of these key issues with respect to innovation.
Yeah, speaking on behalf of our portfolio companies and the market, the national labs are huge, and not just the direct, money they give out, but, they do a lot of, hand-in-hand research with companies. They're testing stuff out. They're putting out white papers. They're giving lab space. It's a very, in a positive way, a very, interactive relationship, whether it's the ones that focus on nuclear or other, renewables. So that definitely is a big piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
This was great. Thank you so much for your time. Really helpful conversation. I think our listeners will really appreciate the insights into what a second Trump administration might look like for energy and clean tech. So thank you for your time, and we'll see what happens in the election.
Nate, thanks a lot. Really enjoyed it. Talk soon.